My friends and I have been hiking and backpacking around the area many times, at least once a year on a good long multi-day backpacking trip. A few times in this same location other than car problems and sometimes friends not bringing the right gear. We've never had any issues. This specific trip was a 6-mile in, 6-mile out, 6,000 total elevation shift both ways trip to a lake. We did it in October, so we were preparing for extreme colds, potentially below freezing at night. There were only 3 of us and we were all geared up for this. I was probably the least geared out of the trio, and I knew I'd be perfectly comfortable. So, we begin the trek in. It took us until the end of the day, and we got to the lake no problem, set up camp, and just enjoyed ourselves to the sounds of nature, some MREs, and a couple pints of whiskey. At the end of the night, we all settled into our sleeping quarters, myself in a small tent, my friend in a hammock right next to me around the fire pit, and our other friend some distance away from us in a tent. Now it's important to note that my friend in the hammock was camped right next to me, maybe 10 feet away, while our other friend was probably 100 feet away or so. I had trouble sleeping, was restless, and even though I was warm, I kept getting shivers frequently and tossing and turning in my sleeping bag, which I just attributed to the cold. I didn't think anything of this at the time, and eventually I began to drift to sleep. The forest around was quiet, with the occasional sound of insects buzzing or a bird taking flight from a tree. That's when I was awoken by the sound of my friend's voice. Clear as day, I was groggy and a little confused as to why he was waking me up, but I clearly heard him say,
"Tim, help me."
I immediately froze as he sounded really desperate and said again,
"Tim, please help me."
Then before I got the chance to speak, I heard the voice again.
"Tim, help, I have to pee."
And then he laughed in a way that sincerely only my friend does. It was a giggle that I'd known him to have since we had met many years ago. And so I responded, "Haha, fuck off, John, I'm trying to sleep." And I thought that he was just trying to be funny. Thinking back on it, it would be very out of character for him to wake me up to pull some stupid joke like that, but I was half asleep and wrote it off. Although I knew something didn't feel quite right about it, I decided to just ignore him and let him do his business. He persisted.
"Help, Tim. I need you. Come out here." I just mumbled about going back to sleep and to just go if he needed to. My memory is a little foggy as to how long we conversed back and forth and what exactly was said, but afterwards, I had noticed that he hadn't made any noise to leave to go pee or get back in his hammock as I was trying to fall back asleep, which I found odd, but again, brushed off as nothing.
Once the voice had been gone for a while, and I assumed he had quietly gone on and gotten back to his hammock, I realized I had to pee badly and wasn't going to get any sleep until I did. So, I got out of my tent and immediately walked over to his hammock to pull the same stunt he had on me, calling his name in a joking manner and waking him up to let him know I was there. But when he woke up, he was immediately thrown off by this. That's when I told him, "I was just going to pee like you had told me you were a bit ago." Maybe 15 minutes had passed, not enough time for someone to get back in their multi-layer cold weather hammock setup and fall deeply asleep again, not to mention he hadn't made a sound since our conversation stopped. He asked me what the hell I was talking about, and I asked him over and over if he was just outside my tent. He swore up and down he had been asleep since he laid down that night and never once got out of his hammock. That's when I felt the real chills go down my spine. Whatever had been outside my tent asking for help in this high-pitched mocking voice that my friend would sometimes joke with was not him. I told him, "Oh, okay, it was nothing then," and I proceeded to go pee, keeping my eyes on my surroundings the whole time. Eventually, I was able to get back in my tent, warm up, and get drowsy enough to sleep, even though the events that had just transpired terrified me to my core. I am well aware of the lore of the areas around northern New Mexico, and I wouldn't be the first of my friends to go missing without a trace had I opened my tent and followed that voice that night. Somehow, I shook it off and was tired enough to start drifting to sleep after I got cozied up. That's when it actually tried to get me. That half-awake state between sleeping and awake. You know, the place where you suddenly feel like you're falling but get jolted awake. Except this time I wasn't falling. Something had grabbed onto my tent and was dragging it at what felt like 50 miles per hour across the forest floor. I felt every bump when the tent was hitting tree stumps and rocks, destroying my tent and trashing me around viciously as I was being pulled at an insane speed through the trees, seemingly in a straight line though, which didn't make sense in hindsight with how dense the trees are there. I yelled out and could feel my vocal cords moving, but very little sound came out. I must have traveled a good several hundred feet like this. That's when I opened my eyes. The only thing that felt different was the tent was no longer moving. During this weird trance state of being dragged in my tent, everything looked identical. I was perfectly aware of my surroundings. It felt nothing like a dream. However, when I finally opened my eyes, I was laying in my tent, seemingly undisturbed and unharmed. I called out to my friend, feeling bad for waking him up, but needing to know that this was reality, as the last place felt so real. He groggily woke up and said something back to me before going back to sleep. His response sounded legitimate to me, I thought. That actually sounds like him. Realizing that whatever I had heard earlier was so far from anything he would actually do or say. That thing that called out to me in a high-pitched, whiny voice, mimicking my friend saying, "Help, help me. I need help, I have to pee. Come out here." It still weirds me out to this day. After asking him about it the next morning, he just laughed and swore to me that he absolutely did not get up in the middle of the night and say anything to me, much less try to joke with me about getting out of my tent to help him. Whatever that was, specifically targeted me. My friends have been back there since. I opted out of that trip. If you like the story, please follow, like, share, and subscribe to us.